nudges in our own lives. As you might, as you might imagine, I will be drawing quite heavily on the work of Richard Thaler, surprise, surprise, but I'll also be drawing upon the work of some other economists. But deliberately, this presentation or this, well, talk without the presentation is going to be conducted in a rather informal manner. So I won't cite too many papers. In fact, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this class over to you at the end of this talk, as it were, and ask you guys to come up with the list of papers that you think I might have used while delivering this little talk. So it'll help you relate whatever it is that I'm saying to academia. I'm also very aware that there are quite a few students from the first year who haven't been tortured yet with behavioral economics, whether by me or by anybody else. So if I mention a concept, reference a topic that seems unclear, doesn't make sense, is something you haven't encountered before, please let me know and I'll describe it as we go along. But because this talk is about personal finance and behavioral economics, I'm not going to begin with an introduction to behavioral economics. I'm in fact going to begin directly by speaking about personal finance and the intersection of personal finance with behavioral economics. So how will this work? Let's begin with a famous example, and my apologies to the second year and the third year students from the BSc program who've already been through this once. But I'm going to begin with a bowl of cashews. And everybody who knows even a little bit of behavioral economics knows where the bowl of cashews comes from. The bowl of cashews is what quite literally started Richard Thaler on his journey of behavioral economics. This was very early on in his career when Richard Thaler was an up and coming economist. He had invited some of his colleagues over for a meal. I think it was dinner. And while he was serving them dinner, the dinner was cooking in the oven, he served them a glass of wine and kept out a bowl of cashew nuts. And the economist said something that the rest of humanity has often said. The economist said, yaar, a bowl of cashew nuts ko hata do. Remove this bowl of cashew nuts from within easy reach because we are going to consume a fair amount of it. And if we do, we will feel good about it right now, but we know we will not then be able to enjoy the dinner that you have cooked for us. Which is, on the face of it, something entirely reasonable, right? Because all of us have said something like this. Well, at least people of a certain age, young college going students don't seem to have the problem of lack of appetite. But the rest of us who graduated from college and now have balding hairlines, expanding waistlines, we tend to worry about the lack of space in our stomachs for more than one meal at any given point of time. So those economists said, ki, remove the bowl of cashew nuts. We will not be able to enjoy both the cashew nuts and the meal that you're going to serve to us. Richard Thaler did that. He was a good host, so he said, all right, if you don't want to eat the cashew nuts, then I won't keep the bowl in front of you. But then he asked himself a question, and that question was this. How does this fit in with what we learn in economic theory? More specifically, how does this fit in with what we describe as microeconomics? One of the conditions of microeconomic theory, and this is going to sound very sophisticated and highfalutin, one of the conditions of or axioms of microeconomic theory is the axiom of local non-satiation. Local, L-O-C-A-L, non-satiation, N-O-N-S-A-T-I-A-T-I-O-N. That's just complicated English for basically saying ye will mange more. And what that means is you are going to assume as a microeconomic theorist that you're never happy with what you have gotten. You'll always want just a little bit more than what you have. If that is true, if we are never happy with what we have and we always desire a little bit more, then why should we as economists ask that the bowl of cashew nut be removed from where we are sitting? Point number one. And point number two, well, aren't we supposed to be rational? Aren't we supposed to be able to calculate and adjust for the fact that if I eat cashew nuts now, I will not be able to enjoy dinner later? So why do I not behave like a rational agent and say, all right, I'm not going to eat the cashew nuts. Yes, they are in front of me, but I won't eat them at all. I will resist the temptation and wait until dinner is served to me. Why did the economists not do that? They preach rationality. They tell people that people should be more rational. So why were economists themselves irrational? And that really is where Richard Thaler's journey as a behavioral economist began by asking, well, why are economists doing this? And then trying to figure out what it is about the mental makeup that not just economists, but all human beings have that makes them behave in such strange fashions. Strange, that is only to an economist, not strange to the rest of the world. And that's where behavioral economics really begins from, by asking what is it about the assumptions of modern economic theory that is different from how, say, for example, the rest of the world might view how human beings behave. What is it about the assumptions? What is it about the axioms of economic theory that is fundamentally at odds with how the rest of humanity thinks and expects humanity to behave? Is one workable way of understanding what behavioral economics is all about. So, right, if that's a way to understand what behavioral economics is, how should we then think about behavioral economics as applied to the concept of personal finance? And there are multiple ways to begin speaking about this, but this is going to sound very weird. I'm going to begin by speaking about genes. Genes not as in the biological concept, but genes as in the, well, clothes that we wear. What about genes? Barry Schwartz, an author whose the title of whose book I've forgotten right now. It'll come to me in a couple of seconds and I'll suddenly say, oh yeah, that's the title and tell it to you. But Barry Schwartz has a lovely TED talk out on a very distressing episode in his life. And that distressing episode is about he walking into a clothes store and saying to the person, the shopping attendant over there, that I want to buy a pair of jeans. Fair enough. And sounds like a fairly simple request. But the shopping attendant responded with a series of questions. Do you want carrot top jeans? Do you want slim fit jeans? Do you want washed jeans? Do you want torn jeans? Do you want jeans of this color, that color, whatever and whatnot? And Barry Schwartz, so by the way, when you watch the video, he's wearing a pair of shorts, and I can't always help but wonder if he's wearing the pair of shorts because he couldn't even buy the pair of jeans that he wanted. But Barry Schwartz's response ultimately was to walk out of the store and say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to buy a pair of jeans. This decision is way too complicated for me. The second thing that I'm going to speak about is, and this is going to sound even more weird, but don't worry, there's a point to this discussion. The second thing that I'm going to speak about is about hip replacements. As people get older, and increasingly so in the times that we live in, hip replacements and knee replacements are becoming increasingly common. So this was an experiment carried out by two economists whose name I've forgotten right now. These two economists, and once again, it will come to me, these two economists carried out a series of experiments in which what they did is they asked doctors a series of hypothetical questions. So one of the questions was, okay, here's this patient, and you evaluated this patient, and upon evaluating this patient, you decided that the best course for this patient to undergo would be hip replacement. The doctor would say, all right. The two economists would then say, we've reviewed the case file, and as it turns out, what has happened is you have forgotten to try one particular medication. If I remember correctly, the medication was ibuprofen. So you've forgotten to try this particular medication, ibuprofen. So would you want to give this particular patient a dose of ibuprofen to see if the pain goes away? And if not, then maybe you can replace the hip. And the doctors would typically say, yeah, well, all right, if I've forgotten this particular medication, then great, let's give this particular medication to the patient and see what happens. Fair enough. What the economists did, and this is where it gets really interesting, what the economists did is they said in a subsequent series of cases, the doctor, here also you've prescribed hip medication, but in this case, you forgot to try two medications, ibuprofen and some other medication. Okay, so now we have two separate cases or two separate groups of cases. In the first case, a patient has been nominated for hip surgery, and that patient has been given one medication to try before hip surgery. And in the second case, two medications ought to be tried before the patient goes for hip surgery. But the economists noticed something different, something surprising, and at the margin, I would say for all of us, something slightly worrying. What they discovered is the doctors, when confronted with two alternatives before hip replacement, then decided to go ahead for hip replacement. Understand this point? It's a little bit of nuance, but it's worth our time to take a look at this in greater detail. In one case, the doctors were told that you forgot one medication, and instead of that one medication, you recommended hip surgery. So would you want to go back and try that medication before asking the patient to go in for an expensive, complicated surgery? And the doctor would almost invariably always say, yes, let's try this medication before we send the patient into hip replacement surgery. But in the second case, where instead of the hip replacement surgery, you now had to try out two medications, the problem got rather more complicated. And the doctor, when faced with a rather more complicated problem, would say, hey, you know what? Rather than try and solve this more complicated problem, I'm just going to go with the default option. I'm going to ask the patient to go in for hip surgery. I don't know about you guys, but to me, this, even though I know what is happening, even so, this seems slightly puzzling to me. Why does this seem slightly puzzling to me? The reason this seems slightly puzzling to me is because, hey, you know what? If you're okay with one medication being tried before recommending hip surgery, then the fact that you now have two medicines to try should make your problem even easier. It should be even easier for you to not recommend the rather more difficult, complicated, and expensive surgery. But when faced with the choice of which medicine to give first, should I evaluate whether to give both medicines or only one, doctors choose to go with the easier option. So we know about Barry Schwartz and his pair of genes. We know about the doctors who choose to go in for hip surgery rather than evaluate a slightly higher, greater detail or choice. And that brings me to Richard Thaler. There is this financial product in America called 401ks. Uh, the name doesn't really matter to us. Think of provident funds in India. 401ks are something similar. And what does hip replacement surgery, what does a pair of genes have to do with 401k or financial products? Once you get employed in India, you have to contribute a part of your income into something known as a provident fund scheme. There are variants of this, but I'm keeping things simple over here. So if, say, for example, your parents happen to work in a firm, then it's all but guaranteed that a part of your parents' income will go into something known as a provident fund scheme or one of the variants that are available, and the employer will match the employee's contribution. Now, over here in India, what happens is once you decide to save this money, and you can't even decide to save it, it's mandatory that you save a part of your income. But what happens to that saved income? Where is it invested? Where is this money saved? In what specific financial asset is left completely unclear to you, the employee. So somebody decides and manages your money on your behalf. But in America, things are slightly different. What happens in America, you can decide where the money that you have saved is going to be invested. So should it be this mutual fund? Should it be that mutual fund? Should it be some other mutual fund? It's entirely up to you. And that's a wonderful thing, right? It's like the economists who refuse cashew nuts. It's like Barry Schwartz when faced with the decision on which pair of jeans to buy. And it is like the doctor who's asking himself, well, all right, should I go in for medication one? Should I go in for medication two? Or should I go in for hip surgery? Similarly, an employee can decide which of 20,000 mutual funds he or she should go in for. But like the doctor who chose the hip surgery rather than medication, like Barry Schwartz who chose not to buy the jeans rather than go through a complicated menu of options, what employees, as it turns out, decided to do is they decided to not choose which mutual fund to invest their money in. They went in with the default option. That is, what employees did is employees looked at the menu of options available to them and said, well, they probably didn't say it in Hindi, they must have said it in English, but I'm going to say in Hindi. They probably said something along the lines of, "Chodna yaar, kaun dekhne wala hai?" So I don't want to go through the time and trouble of figuring out which of these 20,000 mutual funds I should invest money in. I'm going to go with the default option. And that, if you want to run a trivia question at a pub night somewhere in the world, is what links a pair of genes with hip replacement surgery and mutual funds in America. The link between the three is when confronted with a huge variety of options, with a large menu of choices, most of us, as it turns out, will go in for what is known as a default, whatever the default may be. In the case of Barry Schwartz, the default was to wear shorts instead of buy a new pair of jeans. In the case of the doctor, it was a decision to go in for hip surgery, no matter how complicated or risky it was. In the case of the financial employees, sorry, my fault. In the case of the employees, it was to go in with the default financial decision. Whatever it is that has been chosen for me as the default mode in terms of my saving is what I will go in for. I will not change anything. I don't know about you guys, but to me, this seems like a topic worthy of further research. At what point in our lives do we decide, hey, you know what, this is too complicated, I'm just going to go in with the default option? So My favorite example to give, and this is personally applicable, is when I walk into a subway. And at some point of time in the whole decision making process, I just grow too tired and say, yaar, dekho, jo dalna hai dal. So long as it has whatever meat or vegetable I've chosen, that's fine by me. Other toppings, I don't really care. I don't know about you guys, but to me, the process of buying a Subway sandwich becomes way too complicated. And like I said, at some point of time, I just go in for the default. I leave it to the decision making of the person who's making my sandwich. And it's okay for jeans. It's okay for sandwiches. I don't think it is really okay in the case of hip replacement surgery and also in the case of personal finance. But if you're wondering what, if anything, does behavioral economics or behavioral finance have to do with the decision to save, this to me is as good an introduction as any of understanding why we should be studying this. Because when it comes to your own personal finance making decisions, when confronted with a plethora of choices, when confronted with far too many choices, you may well end up deciding, hey, you know what? I don't want to actually choose. I'll just go in with the default. And personal finances matter to you more than anything else in your life, likely will over a long horizon. So choosing the default is unlikely to be the best thing to do. So like, this is a problem, and I've hopefully succeeded in explaining to you why you should study behavioral finance or why you should be interested in learning more about the intersection of behavioral economics and personal finance. But some of you should, at this point of time, be wondering, well, all right, what's the solution? What exactly did Richard Thaler suggest and his co-authors suggest in terms of making this problem better? So what they did is, what Richard Thaler and his co-authors did is, they said what we are going to do is, we are going to give a subset of employees the same choice except dramatically restricted. So instead of giving 20,000 or 5,000 or some mad number like that, we're going to ask them to evaluate a way smaller number of mutual funds. Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 20. Whatever the actual number may be, the point that I want you guys to understand is a subset of employees is given a dramatically restricted choice. And when that happened, then as it turned out, employees grew far more interested in choosing which mutual fund was best for them. Now, neither I nor anybody else is suggesting that they necessarily made a correct choice, correct in inverted quotes, nor are we suggesting that the choice that they made was necessarily optimum for them. But they were much more likely to exercise their choice. They were much more likely to be rather more informed about what they were doing when faced with a limited set of options rather than a large number of options. So if you think about it, mutualfundsahihai.com would actually not be a great website to visit, and the advertisements aren't really all that great, because if a newbie investor takes a look at Shikhar Dhawan advising somebody or Rohit Sharma advising somebody ki yaar mutual funds khareed lo, all right, but once a newbie investor goes onto the internet and says, all right, which mutual fund should I buy? And when on, say, for example, Value Research Online or moneycontrol.com or capitalmind.in or whichever other website they may choose to go to, looking at the number of options, they may well end up saying, hey, you know what, this is not for me. So how would we, now that we are studying the intersection of behavioral economics and personal finance, how would we go about solving this problem? That is, my question to you guys, if you've understood all of what I've tried to say so far, if you were hired by mutualfundsahihai.com or whatever the name of their website is, and you were told, all right, you know, you're an expert in behavioral economics and we have this problem, we want to get more people to sign up on our website. How would you go about constructing a program that is likelier to get a higher response rate than whatever the default is right now? To me, personally, the answer over here would be, can we narrow down the range of choices? Can we say, for example, ask what your age is? Can we ask what your preferred investing style is? And then on the basis of just these two questions, give 2, 3, 4, or 5 suggestions. These are the mutual funds that we would recommend for you. If you like any of them, great, get started. If you don't like any of these, or if you particularly dislike one of these, go ahead and change the option and we'll try and see if we can refine the algorithm for you to make a better choice. But the basic point that I'm trying to make in this particular section of my talk is giving more choices, especially in the case of personal finance, may not necessarily be the best idea. And hey, as a behavioral economist, giving more choices, whether it is in the case of finance or it is in the case of medicine, is not necessarily a good idea. I'll pause over here for a couple of seconds. If you have any questions about what I've said so far, ask away. For those of you who are fans of behavioral economics, you will have made the connection between the what is on your screen and why I'm speaking about behavioral finance today. The cover of the book Nudge has a picture of a mama or a papa elephant, who knows, pushing the baby elephant a little bit ahead, and that's where the word nudge comes from. So, in a sense, this picture is a small tribute to the title of and the design of that particular book. All right, now that I have the presentation up and running, let's take a look at some, to me at least, fairly interesting questions. And this will sound like a really dumb question, but bear with me while you hear me walk you through this. How much would you pay me for this 100 rupee note? Anybody or
100.
everybody? 100 rupees. All right. And that would be the correct answer as far as a finance prof is concerned, an economics prof is concerned, and a behavioral economics prof is concerned. How much would you pay me for this 100 rupee note?
100
Six.
rupees.
Quite right. But here is where, to me, behavioral finance gets a little bit interesting. If both of these notes were in your wallet and you had to pay 100 rupees to somebody, hand on heart, would you be indifferent about which of these notes you'd give out? Or like me, would you be much more likely to give out the note at the left top rather than the right bottom?
Yeah, I mean, I'd give the old note because
Older note.
you want to
Old,
see.
old
Exactly. Quite right. Now, an economist, by the way, would respond to what I'm saying right now and say, but this is hardly behavioral economics. This is just simply value in use and value in exchange. And there's some truth to that. I'm not disagreeing with those economists who jump to the defense of conventional economics. But to me, at least, it is still instructive to understand that there is a bit of psychology at play when you think about the same denomination in your wallet, but your proclivity or your probability of choosing to use the older note first. Yes, value in use and value in exchange is a perfectly acceptable argument, but I would argue that this is as good an example as any from the field of behavioral finance when you want to understand the intersection between finance and psychology. All of you as students of economics have said that you'd pay me 100 rupees for both notes. Why then are you choosing to pay me 100 rupees for uh, I'm sorry, why are you choosing to use the older note rather than the newer note first? Because you implicitly place a higher value on it. This is an example that I've already walked you through. This is the famous Mr. Barry Schwartz. This is hip replacement. And this is the famous 401k plan. And like I said, I am not going to share the list of papers with you. I'll share this presentation at the end of today's talk, and we'll ask you to do the research to figure out which paper I was referring to when I spoke about this particular example. And of course, you should take a look at the TED Talk by Barry Schwartz. You should take a look at the paper by Shafir, and I forget the name of the other author when we speak about hip replacement surgery. And of course, the famous 401k paper by Richard Thaler. All right, what next in our journey of discovery where behavioral finance is concerned? Hopefully this is visible to you guys. And if it is, I'll give you a couple of seconds to read the caption, then I'll explain where this is coming from. Those of you who are fans of psychology will have understood both the cartoon and why this cartoon is particularly funny for psychology aficionados. There is a very famous experiment about delayed gratification. So young children were asked to step into a psychologist's office. They had some sort of sweet kept in front of them, and then they were told that, all right, you have to wait over here. The psychologist said that I have some important meeting, I'll leave. And the child was just kept in front of a treat with instructions to not eat the sweet. And what happens is, psychologists figured out that the longer the child was able to delay gratification, which is fancy, complicated academic speak for saying, until the child learned how to be patient, and the longer the child maintained his or her ability to not touch the treat, the better that child tended to do later on in life. So the ability to resist temptation is what this cartoon is effectively speaking about. The second New Yorker cartoon, by the way, you can spend a lifetime taking a look at New Yorker cartoons and appreciating them. They're an art form unto themselves. But here is a second cartoon from the New Yorker, which I think is particularly applicable to the field of behavioral finance. This is all of us, right? I don't know about you guys, but in my case, this definitely is very much me. So I begin my day by saying, all right, आज ये करना है. This is to do one, to do two, to do three, and so on and so forth. But I always, at the end of the day, find a perfectly good reason to not do at least two of those things, and that's on a good day. Today, as you might already have been able to tell, is not such a good day for my scheduling and my productivity, given what is happening with my laptop and हजार other things. But even so, even if it had been a perfectly normal day where everything worked the way it was supposed to, I guarantee you, I'd not have been able to do everything that was on my to-do list. So why am I bringing up these two cartoons? Because the excerpt that I'm going to show you from a book that I really like about behavioral finance is effectively what these two cartoons are speaking about. The last part of the sentence, both of these assumptions are tenuous, is academic speak for bakwas. So when they're really saying both of these assumptions are tenuous, what they're saying is crap. This doesn't actually ever happen in real life. That is the assumption that people are going to follow through and implement their choices, and the fact that people are able to exercise self-control is just not a realistic assumption. And based on my own personal experience, I would tend to agree. The basic point, if you want to get interested in and if you want to learn more about behavioral finance, what you really need to understand is finance is just one of the things that our mind or our brain tries to do, and it is as fallible at finance as it is at everything else. So if you accept the notion that behavioral economics is a worthy field of study in other walks of life, then you should equally accept the notion that behavioral economics is applicable to the world of finance. It doesn't become more or less important when applied to the world of finance. It's just that finance is so important to us that we say that there is an entire separate field of inquiry called behavioral finance. But behavioral finance is as much a subset of behavioral economics as is behavioral anything else. Paisa, money, it really matters to us, and that is why it is worthy studying behavioral economics in its own right. But what are the two assumptions that we need to speak about when we are studying behavioral finance? And the need to study behavioral finance when applied to the world of personal finance. The first is that people make economically optimal choices. But I would argue that that is not necessarily true. People, in fact, do not make economically optimal choices at any given point of time in our lives. So we will find a hajar different ways to be irrational. So say, for example, you break up with a special someone. Could be a spouse, could be a girlfriend, could be a boyfriend, whatever it may be. You've been through a bad breakup. Good luck trying to tell me that you're not tempted to say, for example, demolish a bowl of ice cream. Of course you're going to be. I would have been. And that is one example. If, say, for example, a job interview that I've recently given doesn't work out, then I'm going to be depressed and I'm likely to make some stupid financial decision. Chalo, aaj ye khareed ke laate hai to make ourselves feel better. If I'm especially rich, it could be a flat screen TV. If I'm not especially rich, it could be some small electronic gadget, a book, a meal, whatever it may be. But I don't necessarily make economically optimal choices all the time. The choices that I make are very much a function of my mood, my circumstance, the people I'm working with, whatever it may be. So long story short, economically optimal choices is a pipe dream, and this is equally applicable to the field of finance. Second, it is assumed that they follow through and implement those choices. But again, I hope I'm speaking to a privileged and lucky bunch today, and that procrastination is not a problem with any of you. But I'm going to be honest and tell you that there are very few people I know who are better at procrastination than me. Putting stuff off until tomorrow, कि आज नहीं कल देखा जाएगा, is something that really ought to be a skill on my CV. Unfortunately, nobody likes to hire me for the skill that I possess in such vast quantities. But if you're anything like me, then you also suffer from the problem of procrastination. I'll give you an example that at least resonates with me. Maybe it resonates with some of you as well. I will start dieting from tomorrow is an emotion that I'm guessing most of us have experienced. The same thing applied to finances. I will start saving from tomorrow. Today, chalo, theek hai, it's my first salary, or theek hai, it's only my first year of working, or theek hai, it's my first major salary after I've changed jobs. So I'll blow this one up, but next month onwards, I'll definitely start to save. So whether it is, like I said earlier, whether it is finance or whether it is something else, the likelihood that you are going to procrastinate, number one, and number two, the likelihood that you won't always make the perfect choice is a very, very real problem that all of us experience. And so also in the case of our personal finances. This is a slide that I've used for many, many years, at least for the last 3 years. And I should thank Professor Amita from Pune University. She attended the first behavioral economics workshop that we had done at the Gokhale Institute. And it was her question that led me to create this slide that I used successfully for many, many years. Alas, this is the last year that I'll be using this slide in my presentations. So what is the slide about? This is a dummy order on Zomato. 191 bucks, and I can't quite remember what, barbecue chicken wrap and a glass of chas apparently. All right, so whatever it may be, the order would have cost me 191 rupees when I designed this particular slide. But the really interesting part to me over here is the instruction that is given below. In fact, there are two things that to me are related to behavioral economics, and I'm going to relate them to behavioral finance in just a little while. But there are two things on this slide that are related to behavioral economics. Can any of you guess what these two are?
The negative instruction that don't send cutlery.
Quite right. The negative instruction that one should not be sending cutlery. And that the reason I bring this up is because this is what the opt-in, opt-out problem in behavioral economics is all about. So what is the opt-in, opt-out problem? What you're taking a look at over here is Zomato saying by default we are going to send you cutlery. आप चाहो या ना चाहो, आपके पास cutlery आ जाएगी. You, the user, you have to tap on your screen on that little box associated with don't send cutlery for Zomato to make a request to the restaurant that please don't send cutlery. So what is the default? The default is that yes, you will be sent cutlery and you have to make a conscious choice for that cutlery to not be sent to you. Now, this is good news for the environment. This is good news for all of us as society. This is bad news for the laziest prof that you'll ever know. I'm going to have to change my slide from this presentation onwards because what Zomato has done is something that Professor Amita had suggested Zomato do all the way back in the year 2018. Her suggestion was that why doesn't Zomato just simply say by default we will not send you cutlery. If you ask us to, then we will ask the restaurant to send you cutlery. So restaurants are now opted out of sending you cutlery. That is a default option. And then you have to make a conscious choice to ask for the cutlery. And so I admit to feeling a little bit jealous and I admit to feeling a little bit bad that I had not thought of this example. So when Professor Amita from Pune University had come up with this example, I was very happy because it's a very relatable example that all of us will be able to relate to. But like I said, I wish I had discovered it myself. Alas, I hadn't. But hey, 3 years down the line, Deepinder Goyal and team have finally decided to adopt Amita Dharmadhikari's suggestion and say, all right, what is going to happen now is a default opt-out program. I will tell you what this has to do with finance on the next slide, but can you guys figure out what the other behavioral economics nudge is on this particular slide?
The donation.
Exactly. So the idea over here is that you have to make a donation of whatever that amount is. I'm looking at this on my phone, so I can't see what the amount is. But jitna bhi rupaya hai, that is by default assume that you're going to give it. And I obviously have no problem in giving this amount, but some users might. And in this case, what they have done is they have decided to go into the default opt-in method. That is, you have to say, hey, you know what, I don't want to donate this money. You have to tap on your screen somewhere, or if you're using a computer, use your mouse or whatever it may be to make this particular choice. You, all of you, can have opinions about whether Zomato was doing it right when the screen is the way it is, or would you want to change it? That is, should donation by default be opt-out and cutlery should by default be opt-out, or should one be opt-in, should one be opt-out, whatever it may be. What does this have to do with personal finance? Now, what this has to do with personal finance is, and this doesn't show too well on my screen, hopefully it does on yours, but another thing that Richard Thaler and team did really well, again, I've forgotten the name of the co-author, is they came up with something known as a Scheduled Deferral Increase Program, SDIP, which is, once again, us academicians are very good at coming up with boring names. But what is the idea over here? The idea over here is how do we nudge people into taking better personal financial decisions? So how do we do it? What the Scheduled Deferral Increase Program does is it says to an employee, all right, how much are you saving right now? Let's say you're earning, say, 1 lakh rupees per month. And out of that 1 lakh rupees per month, out of the 100,000 rupees per month, you are choosing to save, say, 10,000 rupees right now. I'm coming up with completely random examples, but bear with me while I explain to you what the logic is. So the SDIP will say, all right, Ashish, cool, you're earning 1 lakh rupees right now and you're saving 10,000, 10% of your income. Let's do one thing. When you get promoted, and maybe you will start to earn 1,20,000 rupees, which to me sounds like an excellent idea. I am the hypothetical person being spoken about over here. So, all right, what do I do with the extra 20,000 rupees? Now, if you know your macroeconomics well enough, the idea is that as your income goes up, your consumption does not go up in the same amount. Right? So, if your change in income is delta Y, your change in income will not be equal. Sorry, my fault. Your change in consumption will not be equal to the increase in income. It will go up by a slightly lesser amount. If you're looking for a relatable example, if I earn 100,000 rupees and I'm eating, say, for example, 3 chapatis at night, because I now earn 1,20,000 rupees, I'm not going to start eating 4 chapatis or 5 chapatis. My consumption in this very restrictive example stays the same. It's got nothing to do with my increase in income. So, all right, maybe I'll change my consumption in some days. That earlier I used to go out to eat in a restaurant 4 times a month. Now I'll go out maybe 5 times a month. But still, consumption will not go up by the same amount as the increase in income. Should we not be saving some of this increase in income? So can we get the employee to pre-commit and say, all right, from here on in, what I'm going to do is out of the extra 20,000 rupees, I commit now, before I receive the promotion, I'm committing now to increase my savings by X percentage. And that's what I mean when I say kill procrastination. What is skill loss aversion? The idea is I do this no matter what market circumstances. So I'm going to increase my saving no matter what is happening. With all future promotions that I get, I will continue to increase a little bit more of my savings. And finally, the piece that made this especially desirable to financial planners the world over is you should have the ability to opt out of the SDIP. So अगर मन किया तो great, go ahead and opt into the program. But if at some point of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, you think this is not working for you, then also great. Then what we are going to do is we are going to assume that you want to leave the program and no big deal. So that's what the SDIP or the Scheduled Deferral Increase Program is all about. These are a couple of examples of how you might be able to use your knowledge of behavioral finance in order to drive better personal financial decision-making approaches. So one thing that I would want to suggest over here is you can actually think of applying the SDIP in your own life. You don't need to wait until you've been employed somewhere in order to be able to make decisions such as this. And one favorite app of mine that I've discovered recently and that I would recommend to all of you. In fact, what I'm going to ask all of you to do right now is take a look at it yourself online. Search for something known as Spenny, SPENNY. I repeat, SPENNY. And to me, Spenny is a fantastic example of how to make use of whatever it is that I've spoken about right now in your own personal lives. So how does Spenny work? What Spenny does is it says, all right, whenever you enter into a transaction online, maybe you've renewed Netflix, maybe you have purchased something on Amazon, whatever it may be, you can instruct the app that you should round off the expenditure to the closest tens, hundreds, or thousands, and the remaining money should go into your savings account where you can decide what kind of mutual fund you will purchase with the money that you have saved. So for example, let's say you purchase a book on Kindle and it costs say 279 rupees. Now I can either tell Spenny that the 21 rupees, 300 minus 279, go into the Spenny account and that be used to drive up your purchases. Or I can say 221 rupees. So I'm going to round it off to the closest 500. The remaining 221 rupees automatically go into some sort of a savings account. So every time I make some purchase on my phone, I also in effect have decided to save just a little bit. I'm not at all. So to be clear, I am not an investor in Spenny. I don't have any money riding on Spenny. I just like it as an interesting idea. I should also be clear, I myself haven't signed up to actually save on the Spenny app. I have the app on my phone, but I haven't started a savings plan with Spenny just yet. But to me, it's a great way to keep nudging yourself into saving a little bit more every time that you spend a little bit more online. So I'll pause over here for a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, both about what I've said so far or about any of the gyan that I've given you about Spenny, if you have any questions, please let me know.
Sir,
Yeah.
you said that you have Penny downloaded on your phone,
Mhm.
but you haven't started to invest.
Yeah.
So isn't that procrastination if you want to later?
Indeed. Indeed, it is.
So that's the first step in that program that the economists took out.
I love it. The reason I love it is because you put me in an uncomfortable situation over here, and you can judge for yourself about whether I am making sense or not. My defense, and I think it was Yash who asked the question. I'm sorry, I can't see who was asking the question on
Yes,
Google
sir.
Meet. Yes, okay. So Yash's question is about whether I have chosen to not go in for enrollment on Spenny because I'm procrastinating, which is his hypothesis, or whether my defense actually makes sense. And my defense is I want to learn more about the Spenny app. Here is where Yash might actually be right. I have downloaded the app at least a month ago, probably more than that. And by now, I should have taken a decision one way or the other. But I'm still going to go with my defense that I want to learn more about the app. But all that being said, Yash is probably right. And the reason Yash is right is because in the last month, I've maybe taken a look at the app a couple of times, but I haven't done any great research or tried to figure out whether it'll actually work or not. So I'm sad to report that Yash is probably right when he says this is me procrastinating more than anything else. But yeah, Yash, it's a good spot on your behalf, and you're right. I should have either signed up or deleted the app. What else? Okay. If there are no further questions, if there are no further questions, what I want to do is, how are we doing on time? What's the time?
It's
It's
fine.
5.
Can we go on for another 10, 15 minutes? Are we okay with that? Or do you guys have?
Yes, sir.
We can? Great. All right. Just give me a second. I'm going to try and log in onto my computer. And I want to try and play some games with you guys. Just give me a second. Excellent. I think we are back on track. All right. So, do I have the ability to launch a poll? The host can. Who's the host?
So BSc events.
BSc events. All right. BSc events. I'm going to message you separately. If you can put up the polls, great. Who is signed into the BSc events account?
Tejas. Tejas. So where have you sent it?
I will send it. I haven't sent it. I will send it on
Okay.
your personal chat account.
Yeah. Okay.
Second page, I'll wait. I'll message you the question. And I will now message you the options. The four things I messaged you are the options, Tejalpreet, and the first big paragraph is a question.
Yes, sir. I'm putting it.
Cool, thanks. I'm actually looking forward to answer because, believe it or not, this is the first time that I will be responding to a poll rather than setting one up in a Google Class. This is a lovely break for me. And while you're waiting, in an interesting bit of trivia, of course, it doesn't make the slightest difference to you guys, but for some weird reason, my computer has decided to not have Chrome on it anymore, which is both a mystery and a revelation. The revelation is that I can use
Yahoo,
what is
maybe?
this program? No, I'm using Microsoft Edge to log into Google Meet. I always thought you couldn't do that, but turns out you can.
In my laptop, like, I don't know, somehow Yahoo showed up.
On the homepage?
Yeah, like on Chrome itself.
Yeah.
Okay, I can launch it now. It's just that the word limit was filled, so you lose it all. That part cannot be added in the question. So you can see the UL. So after that, it is you lose all of the one.
I hope, well, I don't think it'll be a virus, but you might want to get it checked once. And moving away from Chrome might be a thing I could know. Yes, indeed, Jeet, you're right. Maybe this is a Satya Nadella being evil and villainous. Who knows? All right, you're up. So I think Tejas unfortunately did not add in the last sentence. The last sentence over here will be you lose all of the wine inside it. So that's where the UL. And don't worry, Tejas. So no worries, no worries. That's fine.
The word limit got ended, so I put it in the chat box.
Okay, all right. So suppose you bought a bottle of Sula wine 5 years ago, and I know I'm speaking to a young audience, but assume right now that you both consume liquor and are a connoisseur, which means you know how to judge the taste of whatever it is you're drinking. For those of you who are new to the game, wine is supposed to get better with time. So you bought it 5 years ago for $500, and now 5-year-old wine, it's supposed to be much better, and you could have sold it for 2,000 rupees. But you managed to break it. So how much is your loss? Yes, Mihir.
Sir, is the answer not given in the 4 options here?
No, it's very much given over here.
Okay.
Tejas,
Yes, sir.
could we see the results of the poll, please?
Yes, sir. I switched it on.
Sir, you are on mute.
Sir, yeah.
So, at least the FIBSC students this year will be very familiar with what just happened. I don't know why, but every now and then my computer just decides to make my mic stop working. For the SY and TY students, this is a relatively new thing. I have no clue what is going on. But hey, it's pandemic, right? So everything's fine. Now, the reason I asked you this question is because Richard Thaler has a very famous paper, and the first question, what I just asked you was the second question. The first question that he asks is, all right, you have this bottle of wine and blah, 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 and you drink it. So how much money did you spend? Okay, so the question that he asked you is, एक वाइन था, आपने 5 साल पहले खरीदा था, 5 साल के बाद आप पी रहे हो, पहले 500 था, आज 2000 है. I've Indianized the example, so to speak, but the currency and the amount doesn't really matter. The question is, if you drink the wine, then how much did it cost you? And if you broke the bottle of wine, then how much did it cost you? As it turns out, we are very, very good. Our minds are very, very good at telling ourselves that we haven't really ever spent the money. And what do I mean when I say our minds are very, very good at telling us that we have never really spent the money? The typical modal response in the case of Richard Thaler, when he asked his participants in the survey, the 2 questions, most people would say that they were consuming the bottle of wine. Hello, am I audible?
We couldn't really catch you like for the last, I think, a minute or so. Your screen.
Okay. All right. So, am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So,
Webcam ko goli maro. You guys won't be able to see me right now, but no big deal. So, when it comes to Richard Thaler, he said in his paper that there are really 2 questions. The first is, what if you buy the bottle of wine, okay, and you consume it 5 years down the line? And the second is, what if you buy the bottle of wine, but you break it 5 years down the line? And as you might imagine, or as you might guess, most people, when they were consuming the bottle of wine, said it effectively cost them 500 rupees. कि जब खरीदा और 5 साल बाद पिया, when I purchase it and then drink it 5 years down the line, then what am I drinking? I'm drinking 500 rupees worth of wine. But hey, if I were to break it, or worse, somebody else in my family were to break it, then I would be very, very, very conscious of not the price that I paid for it, but I would be very, very, very conscious of what price I could have gotten for it. Nobody's ever going to actually go out in the market and sell a bottle of wine, but our brain tells us what we have lost when we have actually lost it, but our brain is rather good at not telling us what we have lost when we have consumed it. In other words, the brain is able to tell us decisions about our own personal finances. That's been a rather convenient narrative for the story of our lives. If I remember correctly, the title of the paper was Invest Now, Consume Later, Pay Never. Although knowing my memory, it may be some variant of the title that I just said. But the idea is that our brain is very, very, very good at refusing to acknowledge that we have paid money. My favorite example is Zomato Pro. It used to be my favorite example in the pre-COVID days. And the reason I say it used to be my favorite example is because I don't know how applicable going out to dine is in the times that we live in. But when you purchase a Zomato Pro plan, you tell yourself that you're investing the money. When you go out for a meal using your Zomato Pro plan, you tell yourself that you're saving money. So boss, if you were investing in Zomato Pro when you purchase it, and when you're saving money when you go out to eat, then when exactly have you spent the money? Because presumably you paid money to be a part of the Zomato Pro plan, and presumably you're going to be paying the restaurant, even if it is Zomato Pro program a member, you still are paying the restaurant some money. So when exactly have you spent the money? This is one of the more uncomfortable papers for me to read. Uncomfortable not because the math was difficult or because the language was difficult, but because it, unfortunately, for my own sake, hit uncomfortably close to home. I was, as it turns out, very good at telling myself stories about how I've not actually spent any money. So I plead very, 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 very guilty in Richard Thaler's code when he says, for example, to me that Ashish, you are very good at pretending that you're investing and pretending that you're saving. But let's just face the stark reality. What you're really doing is you're spending in order to purchase a Zomato Pro plan, and you're spending when you choose to go out for a meal. So you haven't really saved money at any particular point of time. And I would argue that he made a lot of sense. Tejalpreet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you one more variant of this question. And if you could please put up.
Yes, sir. I'll do that.
Yeah, just 1 second. As soon as. Is the question. This is true. These are your three options what Tejalpreet is going to put up. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to be perfect because in an ideal world, you should be ranking on a scale of 1 to 5 the three options that are going to come up in front of you. But you just try and make a note on your own notebooks, computers, whatever it may be. Which of the three statements you agree with the most?
Done.
Great. Thanks, Tejalpreet. So for everybody, just pick the option that you agree with the most strongly. Of the three options that Tejal has provided to you, please choose the option that you agree with the most strongly. And Tezel, once again, if you could please show us the results live.
Yes, sir.
Is it live yet?
Yes, sir. I put it. Right.
No, I can't see the responses. Yeah. Oh, I have to vote before I can. Okay. So here's a fascinating part. And the reason I did it this way was because I was very curious to see whether I explaining what the paper was about would make you choose what economists would describe as a correct answer. What you've done is you've spent 20,000 rupees. You can market it however you like, but basically, boss, आज आपने 20,000 खर्चा किया है. So sure, you can enjoy it over some period of time, and sure, at some point of time, you may make a profit on your investment. But today, the only way you can describe what has happened is by saying that you spent 20,000 rupees. But even so, even though I told you what the correct answer is before I sent this question across, the modal response out of a fairly large number of respondents is that most of us, myself included, by the way, I should be honest, I feel like I made a 20,000 rupee investment, which I will gradually consume over a period of years. And it's remarkable, once again, how in spite of knowing what the correct answer is, when I say correct from the point of view of economic theory, most of us, so long as we choose to be honest with our responses, actually do end up feeling that, hey, you know what I've done is I've made an investment. Okay. I know my scheduled time was only for 1 hour, and I know I've overshot it a little bit. Yes, Vani.
Sure, about this question, I felt that if I spent 2,000 rupees some time back, and today the value of those 20,000. I mean 20,000.
Mm-hmm.
Today its value is 50,000. Then am I not saving 30,000?
Well, you're only saving 30,000 if you have chosen to purchase that bottle of wine at some point of time in the future. So if you read the question says, in 10 years, let's suppose that you can sell this case at 50,000 rupees. Today, which statement more accurately captures your feelings? So that is the point
Right,
is...
sir. I misinterpreted it. Sorry.
Yeah. I end up wondering whether it is the fact that you misinterpreted it or your brain chose to tell yourself the story that felt better to listen to. In my case, I know for a fact that even though I'm supposed to be teaching you guys this, which means I'm supposed to know this myself, I still feel as if I've made a 20,000 rupee investment, which is a mind-boggling part about personal finance and how easy it is to be duped by your feelings, even though you should know really what is going on. Now, like I said, I know it was only a 1 hour talk and I know I'm keeping you guys back. My apologies. Yes, Yash.
So I think that partly what you feel is with what thought you bought the wine. So initially you bought the wine thinking that I'll consume it tonight with dinner, but you don't, and you save it. And suppose you buy it thinking that I'll age it and then I'll sell it. So the person who was thinking of aging it, for him it's an investment, but for the person who just bought it for dinner but didn't end up consuming it, for him it's an expenditure, right?
Yes and no, in the sense that what you've described, I tend to agree with. But the reason I say no is because I would be much more comfortable, both from an accounting perspective and an economics perspective, judging something at the end of the lifetime of that particular investment rather than at the start. And I'll give you an example that I don't know whether Yash, it'll make sense to you or not. It makes perfect sense to me. It's quite one thing for me to say when I purchase a gym membership that I've invested money in my health, but I'm old enough now and I've donated enough money to gyms all over the country for me to know कि वो पैसा गया. I'm never going to attend gym that regularly. So sure, I can tell myself that I'm investing in my health and whatnot. But let's just face the fact that I've basically given that money away. And that's where I come from when I say that yes, both yes and no. So whatever story we tell ourselves at the onset of the investment is quite different from what typically ends up happening over the lifetime of that planned investment. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Chief, absolutely. In my case, I can guarantee that I have never once attended gym regularly for more than the first 2 weeks. And I don't mind being honest over here. I'm hopeless at going to the gym regularly. So yes, in my case, it definitely is gym donations. And if anybody on this call actually does regularly manage to go to the gym after paying the subscription, well, kudos to you. Now, what I want to leave you guys with is some pointers about how you can make use of whatever it is that I've spoken about today in your own personal lives. When it comes to your personal finances, what can behavioral finance teach you that is useful? Bear in mind that the guy who's giving you this talk has no moral right to speak about the advice that he is dispensing, because I myself haven't followed my own advice. So with that disclaimer of hypocrisy being issued, here are my tips for how you might use behavioral economics or your knowledge of behavioral economics to drive better financial decision-making processes in your own life. Easy for me to say, I myself have never managed it, but get over the problem of procrastination as soon as possible. Compounding, which all of you have learned by now, including the first year students, by definition means the earlier you start, the better it is for you. So if you have any spare money with you, could be as small as 500 rupees, could be as large as whatever the amount of kitty you have, figure out what investments make sense and get started saving as quickly, as soon as possible. If you have cousins, neighbors, nephews, nieces, whoever who are younger than you, pass on this advice to them as well. The longer you delay the start of your investing journey, the worse it will be for you. That, in fact, is one of the most underrated parts of behavioral finance. The fact that human beings think of time in a completely, I'm going to be slightly politically incorrect over here and say in completely nonsensical fashion. We just don't value future events with the same amount of importance as we give to near-term events. Something that is going to happen in the distant future simply isn't as important as something that is going to happen immediately. If you've stayed up half the night studying for an exam that is due tomorrow, if you have submitted an assignment just 2 minutes before the deadline, if you file your income taxes on the last day that the government makes available for you, then all of you know what procrastination is all about. And in most of these cases, it's really personal finance that is at play, especially in the case of income tax. So procrastination is something that you should avoid. Again, I'm useless at following my own advice, but for what it's worth, I'll try and dispense it to you guys. Maybe you'll be better at it than I am. Number one. Number two, keep things as simple as possible for yourself in terms of choices. And here are some heuristics that help me. Rather than take a look at 20,000 mutual funds, try and group those mutual funds into categories. You decide your own category. Should it be mid cap, large cap, small cap? Should it be sectoral exposure? Should it be investing style? Whatever. So rather than think of 20,000 stocks, can you think of 3 broad categories or 4 broad categories to divide those mutual funds into? And then within those mutual funds, can you create 4 or 5 further subcategories to help you narrow down the range of choices? Yes, Rishikesh, index funds might be another way to solve the problem. So what an index fund does is an index fund mimics a particular index. So say, for example, you're talking about the Nifty 50 or the Nifty Junior or whatever it may be. So rather than you try to figure out which is the best thing for you to do, invest in the index itself by buying what is known as an index fund or an ETF. Absolutely, that's another way to go about it. The third piece of advice that I would give to you is, and this is going to sound very weird, and I myself have never done this, so again, hypocrisy alert, but try and build a balance sheet for your own personal finances. All of you either have been taught or will very soon be taught how to build a balance sheet. So try and build a balance sheet for every single purchase that you make. It's an intensely uncomfortable feeling. I have a friend who does it. I've seen him build out his own personal finance budget sheet, and it is a very dispiriting experience. There is nothing like double entry bookkeeping to make you acutely aware of how much money you waste. And that's pretty much why I've never done it. So once again, hypocrisy alert. For me to say something like this without doing it myself is being hypocritical. But hey, I'm passing on advice that I find useful. Doesn't necessarily mean that the guy who's speaking actually follows his own advice. So build out your own personal balance sheet, number one. Number two, start investing as soon as possible. Number three, try and simplify the rules of finance as much as you can for your own sakes. Would be three things that I would recommend you do. And the final thing, and this is a behavioral economics nudge that I do actually use. So for a change, I'm not being hypocritical. But hey, maybe the fact that I'm using this instead of the other three shows how hypocritical I'm being. Reward yourself for meeting every financial goal that you set for yourself. And this can work in both ways. So for example, if you say that you're targeting to save 20%, 25%, 30%, 40% of your income, whatever it may be, then if you do manage to do that for a given time period, say for example, for a month, then reward yourself with whatever it is that you deem appropriate. Maybe go out for a meal, which is always going to be applicable in my particular case. Maybe buy yourself a small gift, a book, whatever it may be, but set goals for yourself and reward yourself, but also punish yourself. This last bit I learned from Tim Ferriss. I think he mentioned it in the 4-hour body, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe in the 4-hour work week. I'm not sure. It's a slightly dangerous strategy to use, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you follow this exact strategy. But you might want to say he uses in the case of dieting. What he says is, what I'm going to do is I am going to send a picture of myself in, say, for example, my swimming trunks or my swimsuit or whatever it may be to a friend with instructions to put it on social media if I haven't lost X kilograms or X pounds within a particular month. You could always use this example, but in the case of personal finance, if you don't meet the goal that you set for yourself from a personal finance viewpoint, then the threat of you being embarrassed by not meeting your personal finance goals might be a useful nudge for you to apply. I don't necessarily recommend that all of you use the example of swimming trunks or swimming costumes or whatever it may be, but you can decide something potentially embarrassing to you that will come up on social media if you don't use your personal finance goals. That credible threat is something that will likely incentivize you to actually engage in good financial saving behavior.